oh, this is going to be a video that's not going to make me any enemies whatsoever, and everybody will agree with everything I have to say in it. I can't keep that going with a straight face. We're talking about taboos in Commander, and nobody's going to agree with everything on my list here, but these are the ones that I generally see talked about in the community, so let's go ahead and talk about them. The first thing we probably need to talk about is why taboos even exist in a card game. It feels kind of weird, but there is a social component to Commander that does not exist in other versions of really any competitive card game, right? If I'm playing Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, or like Magic Standard or Modern formats, I am expected, when I sit down at a table, to bring my best and beat the ever-loving crap out of you until you stop having life. And if you do that to me first, then congratulations, we shake hands at the end of it and we check our pairings in the next round. But Commander is a bit different than Modern, Standard, and Pioneer. The idea is, or at least the idea originally, was to have something that gave you a break from the competitive aspect of Magic. Usually, judges would play EDH in the middle of rounds or after rounds were done as a way to blow off some steam. Now that it's become the primary way to play, however, a lot of people have started using it as their outlet for some of the more degenerate aspects of Magic the Gathering that are, again, perfectly reasonable in a one-on-one game, but less so when we have a bunch of people at a table with different expectations. Now, I know that everybody has a different idea of what is or isn't toxic or isn't taboo in Commander, and remember, this is what Rule 0 is ostensibly supposed to do. It's supposed to allow us to iron this stuff out before we get into our games, but generally speaking, I think if you avoid most of these things without, expressly telling your group, hey, I want to do a strategy that involves one of these things, then you'll probably end up having more games with more people that aren't going to complain about you behind your back when you guys go out to eat. Like, just, there's that. The first taboo I think we need to talk about is fast mana in casual. I know I've already done a whole video on this when I talked about Mana Crypt, but I'm gonna belabor the point here. I don't think a lot of players are okay with fast mana in casual, and the reason for that is there's a sweet spot of game length that most people are okay with. People don't want a game to end on turn 3 typically, but they don't want a game to last so long they can't get more games in with the limited time that they have. And I saw the comments in my Mana Crypt video telling me that there are some commanders they have that just won't come out soon enough if they are commanders that cost too much mana. And as much as I hear those players and understand their gripes, that's the trade-off that those commanders have for having a higher mana value. Wizards of the Coast, generally speaking, does not make higher mana value legendary creatures willy-nilly just so that they can have more things stapled on the top of their nameplate. It's actually a balancing factor. Your commander comes out later in the game because it is a commander balanced around coming out later in the game. People should have time to prepare to deal with it or not. So when you start talking about fast mana, well, we're talking about things like Mana Crypt, Ancient Tomb, Monk's Diamond, Monk's Opal. These are things that if you drop them down at a table, people are going to give you the side eye. And again, the last situation I had where I had to deal with this was a player playing a green deck of all decks, a green deck. And I was just confused as to why I was seeing all the fast mana come down. And he's like, well, my commander costs 5. I have to get it out somehow. And I'm just like, boy howdy, I'll play my AC deck real quick if we're talking about commanders that cost a lot in green. I don't have fast mana in that, but I do have good old green ramp. But, fast mana, generally speaking, puts games at a pace that most people don't want to play at, and most players actually can't afford. Cards like Mox Opal and Mox Diamond are, $100 to $500. Mana Crypt generally floats around $200. Ancient Tomb floats around $100 typically. These are things that most players are priced out of playing, and if you have to proxy your deck to be able to play at all, that doesn't feel as good for a lot of players. Some players are okay with proxying everything that they play, and other players like playing with the cards that they personally own, and they enjoy being able to play at tables that have people playing at similar power levels. When you accelerate yourself ridiculously high past those players without communicating, hey, my deck has some fast mana in it, they might get a bit blindsided and have one of those 1 to 2 turn games that they really didn't enjoy much. A lot of times when you do this at a table, people will just pick up their stuff and leave after having one game with you, and you may feel like, aha, I won the game, my cock is rock hard now. But let's be honest, if you want to have more Magic games with people, then if y'all are playing similar power levels, you're gonna have a better time. So if you think your deck needs the fast mana, at least communicate with the people at your table. This next one is super obvious for most people, but mass land destruction is generally frowned upon. Nobody's going to be upset if you beast within, somebody's Maze's End before they try to win the game with it, but if you start just blowing up a ton of lands on somebody's board, like if the Gates player gets their Gond Gate out and their Baldur's Gate, and you're just like, heck you, blow up both of those, most players aren't going to be super keen on that. And cards like Armageddon, Fall of the Thran, and Jockalups, they are known entities in Magic the Gathering's lore, and the lore of the player base, not the lore of the game. Anything that blows up all lands does one of two things. Either it means the person's going to win directly afterwards, which happens sometimes, maybe, or it means we've got another 3 to 4 turns of everybody draw passing while we wait for the player who casted his Fall of the Thran to actually win the game. I personally actually had a game where a player was playing an Enchantress deck and would constantly remove the lore counter from Fall of the Thran to constantly destroy everybody's lands every turn. So every single turn, all lands got blown up, and the player was just doing this over and over until the game was done. Didn't have a win con at this point. It was just like, it's an enchantment deck. Of course I have an enchantment in there. It's a Sagas deck. Why would I not put it in there? And their argument was, I got Splendid Reclamation. I can play that afterwards sometimes. But he didn't play Splendid Reclamation after Fall of the Thran, and he didn't have any way to actually do anything after that besides annoy the board repeatedly. If you are playing cards like this, please win the game directly afterwards so that it is basically the same thing as having casted, some big haymaker. But if you do come to the table and you bring Namat the Devastator and everybody gives you a side-eye, understand it's a side-eye that you are going to earn. The main reason for this is Magic the Gathering players like playing Magic the Gathering. Weird, I know. But when they're playing Magic, they need their lands to do stuff. If you blow up somebody's Mana Rock or their Soul Ring, most players don't tend to be super upset about that because those are cards that allow somebody to play ahead of curve. But if you start blowing up the lands they're playing that are just allowing them to play the game on curve, then they're gonna look at you a little funny and wonder, wait, so I'm just not allowed to play the game, but you're allowed to do all of this? Why don't I just go to a different table at this point? Why am I here? You already know how the conversation's gonna go if this is the card I'm showing on the table here. This is FES Oracle. This is a card that has a lot of text written on it, but what it really says is, if your deck is small enough, you just win the game. Now, there's a lot of people who don't like cards like this, and I can explain why. Cards like FES Oracle that you combo with Demonic Consultation, cards like Exquisite Blood that you can combo with Sanguine Bond, dropping a Rooftop Storm and playing an Acerak, these are all 2-card infinite combos, and generally speaking, players aren't really fond of them for a couple reasons. One, it makes a game end out of nowhere. It doesn't feel, for most people, like they've had a chance to interact with the stuff that's happening on the board. Even if a blue player is sitting there and ready to do stuff, it's not like they're preparing for you to Demonic Consultation Thassa them at your casual game of Commander. Now, if you're playing a CDH game, this is the most used CDH kill combo. But if you're sitting at a casual table and, we see that you've got Heliod Suncrown as your commander, I am going to ask the question, hey, you got a Walking Ballista in there? And if you do happen to have a Walking Ballista in there, well, Heliod Suncrown gives Walking Ballista lifelink, and then Walking Ballista has infinite 1/1 counters to fling at people for infinite damage. That's not a super fun way to lose a game of Magic for most people, oh, he played the one card, and the one card happened to kill him. It's why my Exquisite Blood doesn't sit in any of my Aristocrat decks, especially not my Dina deck. It goes infinite with a lot of the cards that are just in the deck basically, like Sanguine Bond is in a lot of my Aristocrat decks, but I don't tend to put the Exquisite Blood in there because, yeah, even though it can win the game basically instantly when you play it, and that feels good, I'd rather win a game off of deck synergies, and a lot of people would rather see a game won off of deck synergies. If you're playing Acererak in a deck, you're probably either playing Dungeons or Zombies, and both of those decks can win a game perfectly fine without having to use a Rooftop Swarm to just infinite combo off. Now, if you do tell people, I have a couple infinite combos in my deck, and I don't have any tutors for them, so if I get into them, then you guys are going to have to stop it, then that's a little more reasonable. If somebody goes, oh, you have a Rooftop Storm, the turn you play it, I'm going to be ready to smack it with a Naturalize or something, then you're not going to end up having as much of an issue. But if you just kind of drop a 2-card infinite onto the table, I've seen more people get salty at 2-card infinites than anything else. In my Dungeons deck, have a 6-card infinite instead, and I've never really seen people get too upset at that one because they're more fascinated by me explaining the loop and how the cards work. When it's just 2 cards, especially when one of those cards is in your command zone, players just kind of feel like the game was robbed from them, and they don't know if they want to go into the next game because is it just going to look like that as well? Am I going to get 2 or 3 turns of casting my Soul Ring in Command Sphere and then watching somebody else win the game and scooping up our cards and shuffling again? Games that last forever don't feel great, but games that just disappear out of nowhere don't feel great for a lot of players either if they're sitting there trying to do a casual game. Now, there is a caveat to be noted here. Outside of Rule 0 stuff, I do think that having some instant way to win a game is important in games of Casual Commander because it can be a stopgap from somebody making the game last, essentially forever for ha-has and giggles. So take this particular section with a grain of salt. Make sure that if you do want to run some kind of infinite combos, either they require multiple pieces, don't have tutors for them, or you're using it as a backup plan in case somebody drags a game out specifically. Otherwise, just check with your table and see if these things are okay with them. Next, we have the Storm or Solitaire decks, and I feel like by calling them that, maybe that will kind of automatically clue most of you into the problem that you'll encounter when you try to play these decks. Now, when you first read them, they feel amazing. When you read something like Joyra Weatherlight Captain or Bergi God of Storytelling going, oh, I can get mana for playing my spells as normal. Oh, I can draw tons of cards for playing my spells as normal. This is amazing. I can't wait to play this deck. It's gonna be so fun. And yeah, it will be fun for you. Anybody who's ever played one of these decks can tell you that there's a particular pattern of behavior that happens with them. You start finding the cards that cost less and less to make the deck run, and then the minute that you get your deck going, usually on turn 2 or 3, you have one incredibly long turn, and then you pass or you win. And after that incredibly long turn, every turn you take from that point on will be a 5 to 10 minute long turn. This is the reason people have issues with Super Friends decks as well that have lots of Planeswalkers. Any deck that requires you to make a 10 to 20 move turn can get really exhausting for everybody else at the table. Yeah, Niv-Mizzet Perun's a 6-mana commander, and he looks really cool, and playing him as a wheels or a draw commander sounds really fun. But these decks are very linear. They tend to not be interesting for the players who are watching you just spin your wheels infinitely, and typically they are either non-deterministic, which means we have no idea when the game will actually end or when your turn will end as you enter your turn, and again, the turns just take a really long time when you play stuff like this. My suggestion, if you really like playing a deck like this, build one and have it in your box and ask your table, hey, this is the thing that I really want to play. I'd like a chance to do it for a game or two. I recognize that the turns can go a little long with it. Is that okay with everybody? That was my experience with my personal Storm commander, Veyron, Voice of Duality. She says whenever you cast her spell, an instant or sorcery spell, give her a 1/1 counter. If you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, then you trigger an ability of a permanent twice. So you'd play her with cards like Bergie, so you would go, oh, I cast Thrill of Possibility. Now I've got 2 red mana instead of 1 red mana. That's enough mana to cast Tormenting Voice. Oh, that's enough mana to cast all of the Impulse Draw that's 2 mana in Magic the Gathering. Oh, and then eventually you realize you're casting 30 cards that turn until you hit something like Underworld Breach and just start casting them all from your graveyard as well. And then, yeah, sure, you might win the game at that point, but you are basically holding the entire game hostage. Yes, you might be the one winning on turn 4 or 5, but the way you have to get there is through such a long, convoluted series of events, and it's a series of events that nobody at the table is involved in. The only person playing the game is you. And I think you'll probably notice that's a theme in a lot of these. If you are playing a deck that seems to monopolize the time of everybody at the table, that generally will be seen as a taboo. Yeah, you might want to play Urza High Lord Artificer as a, artifact commander, or Joyra as an artifact commander. But if you play these cards, people already understand going in what it's going to feel like to play against you. When you drop something like Omniscience on the board, we know that you're just going to storm off because there's no limiting factor to your turn anymore. We're just going to have to watch you play Magic. And even some of my favorite commanders, like Tatiova and AC, fall into this category as well. I have a fully built, full-power AC deck that I do not bring out but once every 3 or 4 weeks, because I recognize that as much as I have fun when I play AC, and it's a super powerful deck that I love slugging people with infinite Scoot Swarms and Avenger of Zendikar tokens aplenty, it's a deck that monopolizes the time of everybody at the table, and this is either going to paint a target on your back, or it's just going to create an unfun game for everybody there. Again, if you want to play commanders like this, that's fine. I have one of them built myself. I had 2 of them, but I took Veyron apart and swapped it out for Urabrask as just a burning commander. But if you do want to have one of these commanders, build it, put it in your box, and make sure that when you play it, you're letting everybody know, hey, if you haven't played against a deck like this before, this is kind of how it goes, and I hope you guys are okay with me bringing this particular thing to the table. If not, I can play something else. If you're honest about that kind of stuff, you'll find that most of these taboos kind of actually disappear, so long as you're upfront and honest about what your deck does, and people say, hey, I'm okay with dealing with that for a game or 2. But that's just my 2 cents on this. Storm players aren't people. This next one is one of those decks that everybody's probably considered building at least once and has really enjoyed the idea of, and then as soon as you play it, you kind of have a problem. These are chaos decks that thrive on, well, nobody really having any idea what's going on in the board state anymore. If you look at cards like Possibility Storm, every time a player casts a spell from his or her hand, they have to exile the spell, then exile from the top of their library till they hit a card with the same type, and then they cast that one, irrespective of whether it's good for the turn or not. These decks sound super fun on paper, but in practice they end up slowing the game down, and they slow it down to a point where players can't even make a win happen, because you can't really easily put pieces of cardboard together if you have no idea what you're going to be casting. Cards like Grip of Chaos and Confusion of the Ranks also rank in this issue as well. They basically create a state where nobody knows what's going on in the game anymore, because nobody can even play a spell without it just disappearing into the aether and turning into something else. These are not super powerful decks. These are not broken decks. These are just things that most Commander players don't want to deal with at a table when they've only got limited time to play Commander. Remember, y'all are all sharing your time. Anything that monopolizes the time of everybody at the table will generally be frowned upon. This next one, I don't really have a visual for, but I'm sure you've had this happen a few times yourself, where a board state has been completely unreadable. People haven't had their lands in the proper place, people have not put their artifacts separate from their creatures, they've got enchantments all over the place, whether it's an aura or not, and their tokens are like just a bunch of dice on the board, or cards with no text on them, or they don't have actual tokens, they don't even have infinite tokens where they're writing what the cards are kind of sort of on them. You glance at this board state and you have no idea what's going on. This is generally a problem because everybody at the table does not want to slow down the game 1,000 times so that they can ask, hey, what's that token? Hey, what's that represent? Hey, how many enchantments do you have there? Hey, what are you doing with that? Hey, like, nobody wants to sit there and have to reevaluate your board state over and over again because they can't even read the dang thing. Please, if you're playing Commander, and this one isn't one that, like, Rule 0 will fix, this is just a you issue. Please, when you're playing a game of Commander, make sure that your lands are in one place, your mana rocks are in one place, your artifacts and enchantments that don't do things specifically with your creatures are in one place, and your equipments and auras are located near the creatures. And, you know, if you're going to have a bunch of tokens on the board, please have some way to denote them. If you're going to put clones on a board, maybe put your infinite tokens behind a creature that they are cloning. If you are not doing something like that, if you're just spawning a bunch of humans, make sure that you've got tapped and untapped humans as 2 different tokens specifically, with dice on each one to denote exactly how many you have of your tapped and untapped ones, or ones that can attack and can't attack. Please separate your cards in such a way that your opponents can tell, reasonably so, at a glance, what you've got on the board. Otherwise, you just kind of look like a sloppy asshole. Speaking of being the only person playing Magic the Gathering, the next one we got to talk about is the stacks or the stasis effects. So these are things like, you know, your Winter's Orb, your Thalia, your Smokestacks. These are cards that when you play them, they are going to slow down the game a ton for everybody, and maybe not you. Maybe your deck doesn't care about this specifically. When you play a Narset Parter of Veils, everybody who needs to draw to make their deck work, the Eowyn decks, the Tatiova decks, all of those decks that need draw power to function at all, suddenly they stop running. And yes, everybody should be running more interaction because it's guaranteed 1 or 2 of these cards are going to slip in the cracks as somebody is playing the game. You should have an answer to these things. However, you should also ask yourself, when you are putting one of these cards in the deck, how would you feel if you were not allowed to draw cards for the entire game? How would you feel if you weren't allowed to untap lands like Winter's Orb is doing? These are effects that, generally speaking, most players don't want to deal with in any major variety. Narset Parter of Veils is going to be seen a little more favorably, though, because at least it does something beneficial when you play it. And it's a planeswalker, it's pretty easy to interact by turning something sideways at it. But if you drop this guy, this Futhermucker, if you drop a Drain of Magistrate on the board, I'm sorry, I'm gonna look at you funny. I'm gonna ask you, hey, what is that doing in your deck? And if you go, oh, well, it's just in here because I'm playing a human deck, and it's a good human. Okay? And in the game of Commander, if I'm told I'm not allowed to play my Commander, I'm gonna feel a little weird about that. It's one thing to counterspell a Commander with a wash away. It's another thing to tell me that I can't play it at all. It's just like playing a Collector Oath when I'm playing an artifact deck. If I open up my hand and the lands I have are my artifact lands, like my Treasure Vault and my Darksteel Citadel, and I'm told, oh, I can't even tap my lands because this is on the board, I'm gonna get a little salty. And I think most players are gonna get a little salty as well. Now, there are some of these effects that you're not going to find cause as much salt. Things like Blood Moon don't bother as many players in Commander because most decks, especially budget decks, have a high amount of artifacts that give them multicolor mana, and basic lands, things that the Blood Moon does not hit as much. But then you just have to ask yourself the question, why am I using a slot in my deck for this? Like, if you really want to play humans and you want to put Drain of Magistrate in because you think, oh, I need to play something that'll slow my opponents down, maybe play something like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben instead. A little bit of tax on top of everything isn't going to feel anywhere near as merciless as, you don't get to play the thing you built your deck around, sorry, bye. Like, if you are playing a stacks deck, there is a place to go. There's two places you can go. One, the CEDH table. Stacks is a perfectly reasonable thing to play in CEDH. It's what I play in CEDH because it slows down other incredibly fast decks to the point where combo decks can do their thing at a reasonable pace. The other place stacks decks can go is to hell. Now, I've talked about monopolizing everybody's time, and there's nothing that monopolizes time worse and harder than taking extra turns. Now, taking extra turns is sometimes stapled onto basic synergy cards. I know there's a rogue one that takes an extra turn. That's not the worst offender in the entire world, but as soon as somebody starts taking multiple extra turns or starts, jacking other people's turns with 13 Emrakul, I'm gonna start wondering, are we playing the game, or are you playing the game? And people who enjoy turns decks tend to be the same people who don't ask the people at their table, hey, was what I was doing okay? Did you feel okay with it? These are the same people who are gonna go, what? Why would you possibly be upset that my Ezri Claw of Progress has a Sage of Hours in it? You shouldn't be upset about that. It's not like you can interact with the experience counters in a meaningful way most of the time. It's not like I did this because everybody was tapped out. Here's the Sage of Hours that costs 2 mana, and now I have infinite turns. I win. Sorry. You don't get to do anything if you can't untap your stuff. Like, if you're playing a deck that has Azusa in it, and you have the Ramming Up Excavator, I expect both those to be in your deck, but as soon as we've got this guy in the deck as well, the Walk of Aeons is in the deck, I'm gonna start asking some questions, like, when do I get to play? And should I just scoop up all of my stuff and go start a different game? Because you seem to be goldfishing. You don't seem to be playing a game of Magic with the rest of us. You seem to just be playing Magic with yourself. And there's a few places you can play with yourself. Again, goldfishing is a perfectly reasonable thing to do if you want to have Thopter Assembly and Time Sieve go together and give yourself extra turns. You can play with yourself by goldfishing. Or you can go to Pornhub. Oh, I know people have been waiting for me to talk about this one. This one is Infect, and there are two sides of the conversation for Infect, and I can understand both sides. One, it's no different than commander damage. It's very different than commander damage. And the other side says, well, Infect isn't anywhere near as strong in commander because there's 3 people that you have to get the life totals down by. And my answer to that is, then we should have the same arguments about aggro, because aggro is not as strong in commander because, well, we have to get 3 people's life total down, except aggro works perfectly fine in commander, and aggro and Infect both work perfectly fine in commander. Most people who make the argument that there's too many people that you have to get the Infect life total down on tend to forget that proliferate effects are a thing, and one of the most prolific Infect commanders is Atraxa. But let's look at Skithirex first. Skithirex has Infect. It's a 4/4. It gains haste until end of turn when you it's like it can have haste the turn it comes out. It puts the Infect counters on a person, and then you just have to cast proliferate effects that just generally help your deck as you go through to increase the Infect counters. I've put a few proliferate decks on my $15 budget challenge, and I might even make an Infect deck to put in that challenge just to have a fun thing in there as a proof of concept. But if you are playing an Infect deck, you are basically playing some form of a Voltron or Proliferate deck that is on steroids. And the problem that most people have with Infect, more than anything, isn't that it ends games too quickly. It does end games quickly. Most people's problem with Infect tends to come from the fact that you can't really interact with the Infect counters. Not generally speaking, not in a super meaningful way. Yes, there are some niche ways you can cleanse Infect counters off of yourself, but for most people, in most decks, there's not a way to deal with Infect. It's the same thing as an experience counter, but with an experience counter, it's one person gaining an advantage themselves, gaining more value themselves, as opposed to everybody being on a ticking time bomb and not knowing when that time bomb is going to go off. It feels genuinely awful to have one Infect counter on every person, and then the Atraxa Praetor's voice is sitting there going, you know exactly what kind of deck I am, and you know exactly what's going to happen in a few turns. It feels bad to me that Atraxa really works best in one of two decks, the Infect decks and the Super Friends decks that either monopolize everybody's time or have a really hard time being interacted with, because I really want this commander to be more fun, but the decks that she works best in tend to be decks that are not fun for most of the people at the table. If you want to play Infect, like with anything else on this list, consider that you need to tell your table, hey, I want to play this kind of deck, here's what it does. Unfortunately, there are some people, because there is a social stigma against Infect, who have never played against it before and don't know what it does. So for those people, when they say, hey, I don't know what that is, let me know, just go, hey, it's like commander damage, but fast. Do you want to play a game with it so you can see how it is? Some people will actually not have any problem with Infect at all and will be happy for you to play those decks at their tables, because there are people who feel like it's no different than just fast commander damage. Then there are other people who really don't want to deal with that. Just be honest with your play group about which Atraxa deck you're playing, please. This is the reason why that Abzan precon from the last few sets didn't end up getting... People didn't end up liking it as much, because it turns out trying to make fair Infect doesn't really work for most people. It's just, you just end up being the Infect player, and then you don't have a fun time because people target you, and they don't have a fun time because they had to look at that deck again. So just do yourself a favor, communicate with your table, be honest about what your deck is doing and trying to do, and that goes for everything here. Or just, you know, don't play Infect. This next one I don't have a visual for either, because it's a bit harder to quantify. It's being a salty player at the table. This is generally considered a really taboo thing. I know this sounds self-explanatory. Nobody wants to be with a whiny pissant at the table, but let's say you do run into one of these scenarios at the table, one of these things that are considered taboo. It's equally taboo to throw a bitch fit about it. It's equally taboo to be toxic to the people around you about it. There are some people that build an Infect deck without knowing that there's a taboo around it. There are some people that build a land wipe deck because they've been beaten by a lot of players saying, I've got a casual deck, and then it ends up being a pseudo CEDH monstrosity, and then they try to find some way to beat it, they build a land destruction deck, and now they're here wondering why everybody's giving them the side-eye. It's just as bad to bring toxic strategies to a table as it is to react to them like an asshole. And if you're playing a game and the game happens to end for whatever reason, or something bad happens to you, like you get blown out, your strategy gets washed away, like let's say you're the Reanimator player and you just got Soul Guide Lanterned on you and your graveyard's gone. Doing things like wiping the entire board with a board wipe and then scooping, like let's say you go, I cast Undo Inversion, all the non-land permanents are gone, and now I scoop out of the game, it's all your problem. It's everybody else's problem. Most players are going to look at that and go, oh, so you're just kind of an asshole. Feels like you didn't want to play this game at all, and the minute it wasn't going in your favor, you threw a bitch fit, and you did it in such a way that mechanically during the game, you were able to negatively affect everybody else's game as well. Nobody really wants to deal with a person who's going to do stuff like that or have those kind of habits. Nobody wants to be at a table with somebody who complains every time that somebody that's not them starts winning and starts being a sore winner when they are winning. Just don't be a bad sport when you're playing. Don't be an asshole. That's probably the biggest taboo you can have. You could build the most toxic deck in the world, but the person who's an asshole at the table is going to be worse than that guy. in conclusion, these are not laws of Magic the Gathering, and there's going to be some people in the comment section disagreeing with all this, and that's fine. These are the things that I've personally observed with this game that generally will get you the side eye at tables and will cause people to not want to play future games with you. Commander is a format that is kept together with an agreement, a dream, and a little bit of duct tape. We really don't have as rigid of a ban list, we don't have as rigid of rules enforcement, we don't have any of that stuff. We have social agreements. We don't have a ban list that takes care of everything. We've got stuff that people might be priced out of and therefore it doesn't go on the ban list, like Gaia's Cradle. This format only works when you, me, and everybody else agree to make it work. And the only way we can make it work is by not being assholes to each other and recognizing when there are strategies that might make everybody at the table feel genuinely awful. Try to find that sweet spot between the things you want to do and the things your opponent would be okay dealing with. There's going to be things people don't like that are perfectly reasonable, like interacting with their board or countering spells in their hand, and these are things that you should be allowed to do in a game of Magic. But then there are things like locking somebody out of playing the game entirely, or completely focusing on a single player, even if they haven't built anything or aren't playing a problematic deck. These are all behaviors that if you engage in multiple times, you're going to be the person that people talk about when you're not at the card shop, and not in a good way. It would be better, I would think, to be the type of player that people want to bring to tables more often. And generally this happens when you play decks that aren't as toxic or degenerate to play against, and you don't have an attitude to the people at your table. The guy who is always angry at his games, and the guy who always brings the stacks deck to the games, or the extra turns deck, I guarantee you have talked about that guy to your friends multiple times. So maybe just don't be that guy. It's not the hardest thing to do. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. These are just my opinions. If you've got any taboos that you want to list down there as well, then let me know. There might have been some that I missed, but these are the ones that I mostly observe where I play. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you got any other suggestions, that's all there as well. The Discord is open for everybody who wants to play Spell Table and wants to come in and hang out. With that all said, y'all, thank y'all for watching. I appreciate it. I can't wait to see the ways people disagree with everything I've said. And as always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here. So, this is going to be a video that's not going to make me enemies. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability a Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here. They would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.